No, Laura, one of the, now obviously there's a lot of the book that really stuck with me, but one of the parts that I found, as given the job that I do, really interesting was the quote that said, "Much of my downtime these days is spent doing interviews which all go the same way." And it's true, you've spoken about your story an awful lot, even in a former version of this program. I've also seen just really horrendous interviews with you.
It happens.
I saw a really bad one on, I shouldn't be saying anything like that, but I saw a really bad one on Sirius.
Oh, yeah.
And the first question was about the title of the book. Mm-hmm. And it was, so you're not one of those people that gets offended by, and you were like, actually, I really, it's a very nuanced issue, and the book's about self-hatred, and just, I felt for you.
Right. Well, I mean, like, oftentimes doing, like, especially, like, short-form radio interviews where, they're trying to, like, sell your book and sell your record, where it's like, we're going to ask you this questions about like your debilitating depression and addiction issues back to back between funny questions and us doing our call signs and stuff like that. It's like just not the time and the place to like all of a sudden dive into a deep thing and then jump right back out of it,
I read Bill Burr, the comedian Bill Burr's bio the other day, and the first line of it is, "First of all, hello to morning show DJs who didn't do their research and are reading this while I'm in front of you." I like that a lot. So I thought what we'd do was something a little different. We'd listen to some music that has played an important part in your life, and then we'd talk a little bit about it.
Okay, cool.
Sounds great. So I want to start off the way you start your book with a song that for fans of Against Me may have been a little bit surprising. It's a song that influenced you in a couple of ways. We gotta get to the chorus. We're not stopping this yet. How good is that, eh?
Classic.
It's a little Madonna Material Girl for any of the millennials who may not be as familiar with it. Tell me when you first encountered that song.
I was 3 years old and living in Cincinnati, Ohio at the time. And I thought that Madonna was saying that she was a Cheerio girl. And I loved Cheerios. So I was like, me too, Madonna. I love Cheerios as well. But I mean, I just like, I remember like just vividly seeing the video for it and then seeing like some kind of televised performance type thing or whatever. It might have been like Top of the Pops or something like that. And just being like, it was so impactful, and that was like my first moment of self-recognition where you like see yourself in somebody or who you'd like to become, of like, I want to do that, like all around, both the confidence she possessed and, and performing and dancing in front of people and like, having that power over an audience and the femininity she embodied too. And that was like also that first moment of like disconnect where I was like, oh, but wait, like I can't.
I can never do that.
And it was just, that was the moment for me.
And what was it about Madonna? And I think I was just so surprised about hearing the influences in those early days, like Madonna, Def Leppard, Guns N' Roses. Again, I wouldn't necessarily say Against Me style bands. What was it about these groups that really ignited your desire to play rock music?
Well, I would lump Madonna into this too with those other bands like Def Leppard and stuff, where they blurred gender lines. Where Madonna, the person she was, she did not represent the image that had been before that portrayed to me of what a woman should be in society. She was like the opposite of that. She was like, take no shit, like up there and doing her thing. And with Def Leppard, a lot of it was like, just picking cool looking album covers too. Then of like, okay, like Def Leppard Hysteria, that's an amazing looking album cover. And, I grew up an Army brat, so overseas I didn't have MTV. I was just like, okay, that looks cool, and reading Hit Parade or magazine. But it was like, looking at all those metal bands or the hair bands, like I couldn't tell if they were boys or girls. I'd look at pictures of Poison and think, they're so pretty, like I want to be them when I grow up.
Right.
So that was like a part of the allure. And then the attitude, the being bring the anti-authority attitude. And then Guns N' Roses like had that edge that was like that much further taking. I mean, like, you know, the world of I'm on a night train compared to Pour Some Sugar on Me was like, you know, night and day.
Did you go see them on the most recent tour?
Guns N' Roses?
Yeah.
I did not. We played Reading and Leeds with the incarnation that was around 2010, 2011.
Like the Axl Buckethead.
Yeah. And that was like kind of disillusioning and disappointing. And I, you know, like, it's one of those things where when you have a band that's one of your favorite bands, you can criticize them while still being like, they're still one of my favorite bands. And so I can criticize Guns N' Roses in that way where I'm like, it's not a reunion without Izzy. Come on. Like, it should really be Steven Adler too, you know, but like without Izzy, I'm not in. That's it.
Let's do another song.
All right.
So you got into an entirely different brand of music away from Def Leppard and Guns N' Roses and Madonna, thanks to bands like this one.
I'll sit around and watch the tube.
First bass line I ever learned.
Oh, yeah. Important bass line. Could you still play it?
Oh, yeah. Uh-huh. Give me a bass.
The only thing we don't have. Put on the mandolin. That is Longview by Green Day, a song that launched probably thousands of punk bands. In some ways, that includes Against Me. The leader of Against Me, Laura Jane Grace, is with me. We're playing some songs that relate to her story. What role did Green Day play in your story?
Very first concert I ever went to. Not just punk show, just very first concert I ever went to.
That's really cool.
That's
a cool first concert.
Yeah, it was like right as Dookie was blowing up. And I was like, I think 13, 14 years old. And my friend Dustin's dad drove us to the show in Orlando, Florida at the Edge. And me and Dustin, we dyed our hair green with like the spray on green dye. And I just remember being there and like it was my first time seeing a mosh pit or whatever and being so terrified, but being like, we got to go in, you know? And I probably weighed 90 pounds soaking wet, go in and you get tossed around like a rag doll and like come out of the show and from the sweat, our skin was all dyed green. But I mean, I vividly remember sitting there next to him and being like, let's start our own punk band.
So yeah, what was that turning point? What is that moment where you went like, yeah, I want to do that?
I mean, that was the turning point, was seeing Green Day. No
What was
joke.
it about them? What was it?
I mean, it was accessible in that way. Like, there's multiple levels to it. And like before that, I was trying to start bands, and I was like, you know, Nirvana and Pearl Jam and the grunge stuff was like I was really into, but they really like fully blasted open the door to punk rock. Green Day did. And a lot of it was that the songs are simple. You know, like there's 3 chords in that chorus. And so we could play them. They're power chords, you know? And it just like the whole scene that it was about, it was so anti anything that all those other bands had been about in our eyes, where it was like, wasn't about being on MTV. It wasn't about record labels. It was like, do it yourself, you know, like just start your own band, start your own label, put out your own records. Like if there's no other scene, create a scene. And like everything that was happening with the Bay Area punk scene was just super impactful on me and my friends at that time, for sure.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about that, because the story of Against Me and the story of Green Day are actually kind of similar in some ways. And this is something that I found so fascinating in your book. 2 punk bands that made it big, but 2 punk bands that in some ways had their punk families turn on them in some way. Before we get to that, though, I want to play a little bit of a band that really did set the table for you in that first punk anarchist scene.
Big A, little A, bouncing B. The system I've got, your body won't get me. 1, 2, 3, 4. Don't control, are you gonna let it get you? Gonna be a prisoner of band stay session. So you wanna be a summer kind of thing, I'll let you. Hello, this is the Lord God, can you hear? Hellfire and damnation, what I've done for you down there.
Also, how good is that?
So good.
Yeah, unreal. That is the UK's Crass with their song Big A, Little A. So Crass is one of those bands that if you hear about so much more often than you actually hear in some ways. I remember hearing about Crass just because a friend of mine had the patch, you know, the Crass patch. For those who don't know Crass, why are they so important?
I think that, you know, in many ways, Crass were the ultimate punk band. Like, you know, Crass were investigated by like the English version of the Secret Service for a forged tape that was like a conversation between Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, where they were like, oh, they got that? When it was like, no, they just cut and pasted that together. Totally. Wow. Yeah. And they were dangerous in a way that other punk bands weren't dangerous. And, you know, to this day have kind of still maintained their mystique just because there aren't pictures of them. You know, like it was the music and the visual was the you know, the incredible artwork that came along with the band, not the images of the band itself. You know, so they had this like otherworldly aspect to that in that way. But like the anarchist politics that they professed, like were just, you know, so much more real than any other punk band I had ever heard. And it was really the first time I had heard a punk band call out other punk bands for not living up to those standards and for like, this is what punk is supposed to be. And, you know, like to do this with it is to betray that, you know, and to sell it out in that way. That was like my introduction to the whole concept of selling out in that way too.
And that's something that comes up a lot in your book, which I think that so many friends of mine who came from punk rock and then ended up buying houses or you can't do anything, you know.
Sure.
Like you end up buying houses, you end up starting, you know, you end up getting a hit or you end up changing genres. I want to get into that in a second, but what do you hear personally when you hear that song by Crass, who in so many ways are the example of what you should do?
Well, I mean, you know, like there's two sides or multiple sides for Crass for me, really. I mean, there's the politics and the lyrics are astounding, but musically, they're one of those bands that I feel like get knocked all the time of people, especially with Penny's drumming, of being like, oh, you know, it's really simplistic drums, but find me a drummer who can recreate those drum beats like verbatim. No one can do it. Like, it was like realizing that just because you don't have the technical ability doesn't mean you can't do something completely unique that no one else can replicate. Yeah. And that became something that was more important for me. And also kind of introducing the concept of hippie punk and blurring those lines of like, you know, living on a commune and like dumpster diving and collective decision making and your band being an extension of your politics, not just singing about your politics, but the way you operate your band and what you do with the money that you make with your band or how you put on shows and how you act as a band, like just totally informed me and is still to this day I keep with me.
But is it harder to listen to them in moments like you detail in the book where you felt like Against Me, you were being called a sellout, people were showing up, I would say fans of Crass, street kids showing up with Crass patches and who had dedicated their lives to living in this certain way, when they were showing up and giving you the finger, was it harder to listen to the band then?
Honestly, no, because Crass were the thing that continued to reinforce me then. Because, I mean, their lyrics literally would echo in my mind of be exactly who you want to be, do what you want to do. I am he and she is she. You're the only you. No one else has got your eyes, can see the things you see. Like, those were the lyrics where I was like, you're right. I'm in this situation. I'm the one being offered this record deal right now. All you punks don't know what you're talking about. You think we're flying around in, like, private jets and helicopters and we're just sitting in this dingy backstage right now. You know, like, I know what is happening here and I'm going to make a decision. And like to see the criticism around that was just like, it was like, you're all hypocrites. You're the ones getting it wrong. That was the way I always saw it. And I know that, you know, like there's some kind of like both sides to the story when it comes to all that, and each situation's different. But that was like what informed me to think for myself always.
But there's that great line in the book that relates to that. I'll quote you. That's the punk mentality, always shooting yourself in the foot before even taking the first step.
Right.
And I love that. Could you tell me a little bit more about it?
Well, I mean, you know, I think that for Crass, for as great as they were, you know, they even set a limit on themselves of like, we're going to end the band by 1984. And by limiting themselves in the way, well, it's hard to say with them because their message has carried on, but like,
But what about you? Like, what about you? How do you relate to what you just said?
I mean, it was like going into those situations thinking like, we want to be huge. We want to change the world. We want our message to be out there and be heard. But then like we feel punk guilt. So we're going to like self-sabotage. And that's been the case with so many bands where, you know, you want that. And I've heard so many punks be like, you know, yeah, we don't want anyone to be into our band. We don't want anyone to listen to our band. And it's like, well, then why are you pressing your music onto a piece of vinyl and distributing it for the people to hear? If you don't want people to hear it, just don't do it, you know? And that was like, there's like that dichotomy.
But I feel with Bad Religion and Rancid and Green Day, the heat that they got felt different than the heat that Against Me got.
Sure.
Why is that?
I don't know. I mean, I'm in ways like thankful for that, because to me it seems like it, you know, like, I don't know, maybe egotistically feels like, oh, well, maybe we were like special in a different way than those bands were, even though we were just another punk band too, you know?
But I don't know. Like, do you think that your message being it's maybe a little bit more political than Green Day's was in the early days, that might have had something to do with it?
I think maybe also being tied to the scene that we were particularly tied to, especially the end of the 90s, beginning of the 2000s, around the anti-globalization movement, everything that was happening with the WTO, the activist scene there. I think, being a band that was really fostered by that scene and coming up in those politics, that as things started to change and as the band started to change, that's where that backlash stemmed from.
And I should point out that the backlash, unlike now where it might be a bunch of mean tweets, it was something.
Tweets hurt. No.
I mean, by the way, tweets totally hurt. I'm not discounting it. As someone with anxiety, tweets are debilitating at times. Uh-huh. But what you experienced was more than just tweets as a backlash. Can you give people listening to this, can you give me an example of what I'm talking about?
I mean, we had everything from people slashing our tires on our van to graffitiing our van, graffitiing equipment, to physically trying to stop us from playing shows, to there was a columnist in Maximum Rock and Roll, the old fanzine, who wrote a column telling people to sabotage our shows at all costs, to pour bleach on our merch. That same person came to a show once and threw stink bombs on stage. There, any form of that, someone took a diaper filled with feces and rubbed it all over the front of our van window.
Holy God.
Just any form of grossness or nastiness was directed towards us back in those days.
So now that you have the ability to reflect on it, what do you think you've learned from that experience?
I feel validated, is in that I'm still here. I'm still doing what I love, and that was kind of always something I kind of knew in the back of my mind too, with the punk scene especially, because I figured most of y'all aren't even going to be punk in a couple of years anyways. You're saying what you're saying now, but are you going to be around? Are you I know this sounds cliche, but are you punk for life? Are you a lifer? Are you in it for the long haul? Or is this just a fashion thing for you? Is this just a fad? And for me, I decided long ago that it wasn't, that this is what I'm doing with my life. And because it was that think for yourself mentality of using logical, critical thinking to realize that you were sure in your beliefs. And being called a sellout to me made me question, well, what does it mean to sell out? And to me, what it meant to sell out would have been to give up on my dreams of being in a band and being a musician. I didn't pick up a guitar and become a band and start playing music because I wanted to have it as a platform for my politics. I was drawn to music from the beginning. I got a guitar when I was 8 years old. I just then so happened to become politically minded, and the two things intertwined.
Right.
I wanted to be a musician regardless. You could still be punk rock and be a doctor. I just wanted to be a musician, So that was it for me. For me, selling out would have been, putting down my guitar and getting some job I hated. And, I say this every night now when we're on tour with Green Day, where, I'm up on stage and I tell the audience, I'm like, my first show I ever saw was Green Day when I was 14 years old. And I tell them that story of sitting on the curb and thinking, I want to do that. I want to be the person up there on stage. And then, saying look, I know there's a barrier between us right now. I know there's security guards right here, but it's all an illusion, because I know there's at least one kid out there in the audience right now who's going to leave the show. They're going to go home. They're going to start their own band, and they'll change the world. They'll be the one up there on stage in an arena, headlining, whatever, in a couple of years, because I know that to be true, because it happened for me. And I'm up there with the band that I first saw. And to me, that's the ethic of DIY, where DIY sounds like do it yourself. But to me, DIY never meant do it alone. It meant do it with your friends, and that it takes everyone to make it happen.
It's beautiful. Let's listen to some more music.
Right on.
This is fun.
Yeah,
I'm having a great time.
Cool, me too.
If the calls of there were some calls of sellout, and I love the perspective that you've gained from it. But I want to play an Against Me song that you released later on a major label, and it kind of took your band to an entirely new level.
If she wants to dance and drink all night, well, there's no one that can stop her. She's going till the house lights come up, or her stomach spills onto the floor. This night is gonna end when we're damn well ready for it to be over. Worked all week long, now the music.
I could sing along, but it'd be redundant.
And there's no count-alongs we can do either.
Could try crowd surfing.
From their album New Wave, that's a little thrash and reel from Against Me. Singing the vocals there is Laura Jane Grace, who joins me here in the studio. At this point, from the outside, it looks like you have it all. A hit record, a radio single, world tours, major label, money, a wife, soon a child. And it looks amazing, and I know from reading your book that it wasn't. So where in your life, what do you hear when you hear that song?
I mean, to me, honestly, it draws it back to the period right before kind of like everything happened, as far as like the period of writing that record and recording New Wave was magical. And it was a really good period of time. And I have really happy memories from the studio with Butch and the band.
This is Butch Vig.
Yeah. And falling in love and eventually getting married after the record came out. Mm-hmm. It was really once the record came out that kind of like that fantasy world like started to shatter.
What do you mean?
Well, then like the backlash came in full force, and like, when you're in the studio, even though like the punks are gonna hate it, you're still under the illusion of like maybe the punks will actually like it, and then it comes out and you're like, nope, the punks hate it.
I was right.
Dang it.
But it was a very, very dark time for you personally as well.
Sure.
What got you through it?
I mean, honestly, it was like, to me, back in those days, like living compartmentalized with gender dysphoria and being closeted and not talking about it, like the distraction was signing a major label deal and recording a record with Butch Vig and working on a record. So being able to be like when you're pulling that many hours in a studio each day, like waking up, going straight in the studio at 10, 11 in the morning and being there till 11, 12 at night, you don't have time to think about much else,
Right.
So it was like, that was the distraction, was that, and then you go out on the road, and then you don't have that distraction anymore.
And is it the kind of thing that like you feel like if I just sell a few more records, if I just get a little bit more famous, if this does a little bit better, then maybe I won't feel this gender dysphoria that I feel right now?
Sure.
Was the success chasing that?
Yeah, for sure, 100%. I mean, like specifically even with the record before that, Searching for a Form of Clarity. Before that record, I had been going through a really hard time with addiction issues. And I made the decision going into that record was like my last purge, so to say, where I was like, okay, like no more of this transsexual behavior, and I'm going to be a man, and we're going to sign record deals, and I'm going to do this full on. I'm going to be in this band, and this is what we're going to do. And I sobered up and really focused on the band. And that was when we decided we weren't going to sign to the major label, and we were going to stay indie. And then we stayed indie, and then we still ended up having to make compromises with their art. So then we were like, well, if we're going to still have to make compromises, why not just take the money as opposed to making compromises for no money with no contract? Yeah. Right. So we did, and it was just, I was under the impression if we could blow it up, if we could become the biggest band in the world, then I could forget about that person I was or any of those thoughts or feelings that I used to have, and then I'd just live happily ever after and die a rock star.
Right. We're gonna play another song, and we were talking at the beginning a little bit about how this might be a little bit of a different interview. We're gonna try to do things differently. This is a moment where we're not gonna do things too differently. I'm just gonna let you know that right now.
All right.
This is the final track off of New Wave. I want to play a short clip from it. Just take a listen to this.
If I could have chosen, I would have been born a woman. My mother once told me she would have named me Laura. I'd grow up to be strong and beautiful like her. One day I'd find an honest man to make my husband. We would have 2 children.
It's Against Me with the Ocean. Laura, in an incredibly clear way, you spell out who you truly are. Like, if I could have chosen, I would have been born a woman. My mother once told me she would have named me Laura. This was written years before you would live openly as a woman.
There's no metaphor there. There's like zero metaphor in those lyrics.
Do you still sing it?
We do, yeah.
Yeah. And how does it feel to sing it now?
It feels very empowering now. It feels really validating now, too, because that song in particular, we had to fight even to get it on as the last song on the record.
Why?
The label didn't like it. I mean, there's no chorus to the song. It's just 2 verses and then like a weird outro.
Right.
It's not structurally a song that a record label wants you to have on the record. The lyrics are kind of weird per se. I mean, I listen to that, especially with a pair of cans on, and I'm like transported to being in the vocal booth and singing that lyric and stopping and being like, does anyone in there think that sounds a little weird?
or does anyone in there... Is anyone in there guessing what I'm talking about?
Right, just looking for some kind of reaction.
And not to be rude, but there's a part of me that was going like to the guys in the band, say like, didn't you guys start asking some questions around then? Like, just make sure you were okay and question that lyric a little bit?
Sure. And no one did. And that would kind of like even further spiraled me of feeling like,
What do you
okay,
mean?
like no one did. Everyone was just like, yeah, it's cool, go with it, you know? And like then no further questioning, no further like nothing discussion around it, you know? And it like left me feeling like, oh, is anybody even like paying attention to what I'm singing?
Right.
Like, or can I just say anything up here and it doesn't really matter? And if so, what is that really saying about the people who are listening to the band? Are they just listening because we are that next big thing and because Spin is calling our record #1 album of the year? Or are they interested in actual politics? Or were the people who are actually interested in what I'm saying, have we like forsaken them and left them behind for this new group of fans who don't care?
And where did you land? Like, where'd you end
I
up?
landed on thinking that no one actually cared and no one actually was paying attention, and that just made it more and more miserable and made it all harder, you know?
So to tell me a little bit about making that, like when you ultimately make the decision to reveal the secret again that you've been hiding in plain sight, were you able to go like, see, I told you?
Well, I mean, I wasn't like so smug as to actually.
Well, not like that.
rub it in
See, you know what I mean? There, you know.
Right. I told you. No, but I know that like from talking to people, like many friends did have that aha moment, you know, especially even my band when I came out to them, like the studio that we were recording at was like an hour drive from everybody's home or whatever. And I know that James said like on that ride home that day, he was like sitting in the car being like, oh, and like a lot of the things that, you know, had been triggering things for me along the way when like band relationship dynamics, you know, outside of lyrics or anything like that, where other people would never understand why I was upset with something, all of a sudden made sense to them. Like an example of being like Andrew, who used to play bass in the band before going on stage, would, you know, slap us all in the back and be like, all right, boys, let's go out and do this. And like every time it would just be like, okay. You know, like I can't say anything to him because then I have to explain myself, but I'm going to be upset by this and it's going to ruin my show.
And I mean this with the utmost of sensitivity, because speaking about interviews that you've done a million times, you've also been asked this one a million times. But I do want to ask this for people who are listening. If you don't mind, when was the moment? Why did you decide to reveal this about yourself?
There's multiple reasons, you know, or there was lots of things that built up to it, you know, and it was really reaching a point of having gone through the whole major label roller coaster, having gone through a lawsuit with like an ex-manager, having the band fall apart in the process, and like feeling like there was nothing true left. It ironically churned my dysphoria into a source of empowerment, where it was like, this is one thing I know to be true that no one else knows. And in this weird way became like an edge and like this like, you know, this like ace card that I had of like, you don't know this about me. And like, this is my thing that I actually have that you can't take away from me. And so it just reached a point of like, of abandon, of like, either I'm going to move forward and I'm going to accept this about myself, or I'm going to kill myself. And I took a year of like, after we got out of the major label deal, of like, all right, you know, I've been struggling with this, and like having a kid played into it, being married, all those trappings of, you know, of feeling like, okay, on paper, this is everything, you know, like I have a house, I have 2 cars, I have a kid, I have a wife, like I have a band and we had success, you know, I mean, like things might not be that great right now, but I should have it all. I should be enough, but it's not enough. It's never going to be enough because of this. And if I don't accept this, then I'm going to die. I'm just going to keep drinking. I'll keep doing drugs and it'll kill me, you know? So it was reaching that point of abandon of like, I have nothing to lose and I have to do this.
Mm-hmm. Laura, you know, we've been talking a little bit about doing these interviews, and I just had a thought that almost immediately, I mean, the way this came out to me as a listener was in Rolling Stone. Mm-hmm. It was a press interview. I saw you shortly afterwards with George Stroumboulopoulos on his television show, and a million press interviews was talking about this at that moment, made easier or harder by how often you had to talk about it.
I feel bad because sometimes I felt like I was like exploiting interviews as free therapy. where it's like, I'm just going to go into this, I'm going to talk about my problems. And that was something I learned about seeing therapists anyways, was like oftentimes, because I'll tell people if they're asking for advice, like go see a professional,
Right.
you know, like talk to somebody. And oftentimes what I learned was that it wasn't what the therapist was saying to me for advice. It was just hearing myself verbalize what I was feeling that helped me think about it, as opposed to being totally in my head and not having anyone to talk about it. So talking about things out loud, even in an interview context, helped me think about it, where I was like, okay, I understand this about myself a little better. And especially being in a pressure situation where it's like, okay, I'm on the spot, there's cameras rolling and there's tape rolling, like, like think about this, and how do you feel about this? And knowing too that like I was more willing to talk about it because having done like however many years of interviews that were like, what does punk rock mean? Are you all sellouts for being on a major label? Which I just couldn't have cared less about. I just didn't want to talk about those things anymore. So talking about this, it's real.
Let's have one more song.
Okay.
Let's do it. All of a sudden, Against Me isn't dead. It's thriving.
Tonight I can't sleep because I'm haunted. So I'm breaking spells of intention. All I can see is a space in between, the space where you're missing. I once was drunk on you, so very stoned.
That's a great drum sound.
Great drummer.
That's a great tom, that's a great, great sound.
Yeah. Mark Hudson.
Beautiful. I mean, the whole record's beautiful.
Thank you.
I guess the floor tom at the beginning of that thing just drives me bonkers.
Adam is an insane drummer.
Beautiful. From their latest album, Shape Ship With Me, that was Against Me, with a little of the song Haunting, Haunted, Haunts. I think there were moments in your book where you can tell that you weren't entirely sure that you would go on, and you just talked about a little bit about that. Are there moments when you're on stage and you look at your bandmates or you look at the crowd and you just can't quite believe it's still going, you're still here after all these years?
Every night. I've really been able to like find a place where I have that kind of ability to be in the moment and appreciate things,
Is
like
that important to do that?
Yeah.
Is that new for you?
totally.
What makes
Yeah.
you want to do that?
To be thankful, to be like thankful and present for like the luck and life I have, and especially being a parent and making the sacrifice of like, okay, like I got to keep on doing this for many reasons, like sure, it's like what I do for a living, but like this is what I love doing. It's what I've always wanted to do, and it sustains me. And in order to do that, I have to be away from my kid to be on tour, like, so if I have to make that sacrifice, then I have to make the most out of this, and I have to be fully appreciative of that and fully present and aware in the moment. And when I'm like on stage opening for Green Day and I'm in an arena full of people and like you look up and you're just like, wow, you're like, like you can't not appreciate that moment,
I mean, because most bands I speak to, I ask them that question like that, and like, oh, we don't really think about it. Maybe if we get a minute on the plane, we'll take some time and think about where our careers have gone, and I can't believe I am. But typically, you're just working, but you do take some time.
For sure. And I think that it's like, it surprises me in a way that like I didn't think it would work like this, where it's not like having, like stopping being a musician and then years later coming back and being able to appreciate it. For me, it's like suddenly realizing like, oh man, I've been playing in this venue for like 17 years now. And like, my perceptions of it's changed and I have all these memories attached to it, but that's crazy. I've been coming here and then realizing like, oh, that one venue we used to go to, that venue is no longer here. And oh, that record store that's around the corner, that record store is gone now. And like being appreciative of like the people who are a part of it all and the places that are a part of it all. And that I have been able to go back to it, or that you never know when it will end, I mean, I feel very conscious of those things and like want to remain so.
Laura, it's been a real pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. Pleasure's mine.
This has been a lot of fun. Before I let you go, throughout the book, and this is kind of hard for me to ask, throughout the book there are moments where you talk about how in press and when you did interviews you had to kind of put on the face and say everything was good, whereas inside maybe things weren't that great. How are you?
I'm really good right now.
Yeah?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Awesome.
I mean, like people, I feel like sometimes people have like an realistic expectation of what life is.
What
with
anyone
that.
can be.
Right, where it's like, and then we lived happily ever after. It's like, no, it's life. You have your good days and your bad days. But all things considered, I'm as good as I can be,
Laura Jane Grace, it's been a pleasure.